Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with some musings on why percussion concertos are impossible. And I really mean it. I have never heard a satisfying concerto for percussion instruments. Now, I want to make a distinction between music for percussion ensemble. That's different. That's very, very different. But as some of you may have noticed from these various talks, I am a percussionist, and you might call me a self-hating percussionist because I've never heard a percussion concerto that I enjoyed, that I found musically satisfying for the percussion writing. That doesn't mean the percussionist didn't have a whale of a time playing it. I've seen some of them live, but the idea of writing percussion concertos sort of started with Schwantner. Remember his thing? That one got a lot of play about 30 years ago or something like that. But since then, they have proliferated, and I've heard so many of them. I mean, there's James McMillan, and there's H.K. Gruber wrote a passel of them, and Christopher Rouse, and Jennifer Higdon. There are just lots of percussion concertos. Some of them have cute little titles. All of them involve all kinds of slamming and banging by one person running around, and it's fun to watch. I make no mistake. You see Evelyn Glennie sitting down there surrounded by 30 billion instruments, banging and smashing her way through them. It's all lovely. But is it musically satisfying? My answer is no. And I've been thinking about why that's true. And I think that the answer rests in, of course, the nature of the instruments and their relationship to all of the other instruments in the orchestra. Here's the problem. Here's the problem as I see it. And you can disagree with me, of course, but here's the deal. Remember when we were talking about Debussy's nocturnes, and we were talking about the relationship between voices and instruments. And Tovey, the great Donald Francis Tovey, pointed out a fascinating acoustical fact. What he said was, as soon as you hear a human voice, you automatically expect that there should be words. And you zero in on it. You focus in on it like a laser. And all of the other instruments, no matter how many there are, get thrust into the background. Or you wish that they would. For example, how many times have you heard a singer, a song, or an opera singer, and the orchestra's too loud, and you can't make out the words, and it drives you crazy because you can't make out the words, because every fiber in your being wants to focus your attention on the meaning conveyed by words as sung by a human being. We are hardwired to feel that way. And there's absolutely nothing we can do about it. It's just the way we're built. Even if you like instrumental music or orchestral music, as I do, and you prefer that to vocal music, it's not going to make any difference. As soon as a voice shows up, it's the thing that's going to matter, no matter what. So we're built to want to hear meaning expressed by the voice, usually through communicating with words. And Tovey's issue with the Debussy nocturnes was, what happens when you have wordless chorus or voices that don't sing words? What does that do if you have a body of them, like, a women's choir, as you do in Sirène by Debussy, or The End of the Planets? You still focus on it. And is it going to be frustrating or aggravating because you're not gratified with the actual conveyance of meaning through words, or will you somehow deal with it? And does it work? Well, obviously, Debussy's Sirènes works. It works beautifully. It sounds fabulous. Why does it sound fabulous? Because the whole idea is to present this sort of enchanted, mystical, non-human, alien, magical sort of mythical creature. And so it works. It works because for the very simple reason that he's using voices in a non-human way. And the strangeness is what makes the music so marvelous. And that's what we hear. We hear the strangeness. It's the same thing at The End of the Planets. It's the strangeness that makes the piece. How does this affect our experience of percussion concertos? Well, let's put it this way. Different musical instruments are good at different things, right? They all are, and they have different musical qualities, right? There's staccato, there's legato, there's harmony, there's counterpoint, there's rhythm, obviously. I mean, the organ is a wonderful example of an instrument that's fabulous with harmony and fabulous with counterpoint and dreadful when it comes to rhythm. Not every instrument has every possible musical quality. There is dynamic range, there is range and pitch, there's all those things. The ability to play multiple notes simultaneously. Percussion instruments are the most limited of all the instruments in the orchestra. Basically, they're only there to provide rhythm or to color the pitches of other notes. Even pitched percussion, a glockenspiel or a xylophone, they seldom get to play solos that are unaccompanied or unsupported by other instruments. You always hear xylophone and piccolo or glockenspiel and pizzicato violins or something to give the tone a little bit more body in normal orchestration. But of course, in the 20th century, percussion instruments have gone completely insane. That is, there's billions of them, and percussion players are so fabulous. I mean, they are so talented. It used to be, remember, Liszt was playing the triangle in his own piano concerto, where one of his buddies did it. Hans von Bülow. He just lassos somebody and hand them some crappy piece of metal and tell them to hit it at the right time, and that was the percussion section. But now these people are tremendous, beautifully trained virtuosi, so of course they want concertos. And composers are more than willing to do it. But I wonder whether those composers, however ingenious and gifted they may be, have really thought about the challenge of writing for percussion instruments. Not writing for the instruments idiomatically, but writing for them in the context of an orchestra. Because the issue is one of contrast. Here is the bottom line. No matter how many percussion instruments you give the percussionist to play, no matter how many there are, whether they're tuned or untuned, they are so limited in what they can do musically. The unpitched instruments, they can contribute nothing but rhythm and color, and any other musical substance has to be carried by the other instruments, by some other way. The other instruments of the orchestra. The pitched instruments, well, they're a little bit different. They can play a tune, they can play a motive, they can convey a little bit more of musical meaning. These days, mallet players, they can hold like 20 mallets in their hands and hit enormous chords all up and down. Vibraphones have wonderful sustaining power. You can get a little bit better. And some composers have written, of course, concertos for mallet instruments, which are a little bit different. But there's still a problem. The problem is that A, you're not going to get much dynamic range out of them because they just don't have it. And B, the timbre is monotonous. I mean, a xylophone, what could be less interesting in timbre than a xylophone? It's fabulous when you use it in the right spot. In Saint-Saëns' Danse Macabre, what could be more like the bones rattling on a skeleton than a xylophone? But, to be the main focus of attention for a piece 20, 30 minutes long? No, it's not going to work. That's why in percussion concerti, they have to play 400 different instruments, because you can't listen to any one of them for more than a minute or two before your ear gets tired, before you want some contrast. And that's the essential question. Why do you want contrast? You want contrast because every other instrument in the orchestra is better than the percussion for what musical purpose they're there for. In other words, they can play loud and soft. They can play staccato and legato. They can play, multiple pitches. They can play vocally with more cantabile. They can do all kinds of wonderful things. They have a greater range in terms of what they can do. They all make the percussion sound bad. And that's the trouble with percussion concerti. The best percussion concerti, the ones that I've enjoyed, and I've enjoyed a lot of them. I enjoyed Rouse. I enjoyed Higdon. I mean, I liked them musically, but not for the percussion. Why? Because every other instrument in that orchestra is more interesting than the percussion instruments are. They're wonderfully colorful. They're exciting. You can whip up a great storm of virtuosity. I can admire the virtuosity of the performance. But it's not the focus of attention, even when it is the focus of attention. That's the problem. That's the problem. You put the percussionist with any other bunch of instruments, or Bartók's, the Sonata for two pianos and percussion, and you automatically focus on the thing that delivers the most musical rewards, which we define instinctively as vocal melody, or some kind of harmony, or some kind of line, musical line, or some sort of contrapuntal fabric, something. There's a hierarchy of musical interest, and maybe people have different things in ranking them, but in all of those hierarchies, percussion instruments are the most limited, and they come out on the bottom. So when you stick them in a context with nothing but instruments that do things better, it's going to be disappointing. It's going to be disappointing musically as a vehicle for the percussion soloists. No matter how many instruments you give him or her, no matter how virtuosic the part is, it's always going to be a letdown. At least for me, it is always a letdown, because I do believe that there are certain natural qualities that we as human beings are sort of genetically engineered to recognize. And so, although percussion is primal, rhythm is one of the most primal qualities in music, and we can adore rhythm. How long are you going to adore it for? I mean, nothing but 30 minutes of rhythmic tattoos? I don't think so. But that's why percussion ensemble music can be extremely satisfying. That's why Velez's ionization is such a work of genius, because, first of all of the instruments share the same musical pluses and minuses, the same advantages and deficiencies, basically. So they work as a coherent ensemble. You don't regret the fact that the violin is there. And when someone like Lou Harrison writes his concerto in Slendro for violin and percussion ensemble, the violin is the soloist, not the percussion ensemble. You experience the soloist. The proportions are correct in the way that the composer has imagined the work. Back to ionization for a second. It does use a piano, but the piano only plays block chord clusters at the very end. That's the only time you get actual pitches, and they're like, with your arms, a piece of wood, something like that, to create a tone cluster. Whereas uses the instrument in the most percussive possible way and denies it those musical qualities, which, if he had exploited them, would make the entire percussion ensemble sound completely irrelevant and useless as the conveyor of musical expression. And that, my friends, is my theory about why I don't like percussion concertos. Now, some of you may love them, and maybe I'm making too much of this. But I do think that there are other instruments that should never have concertos written for them. And it's never stopped composers from writing them or people from playing them. Double basses. What could be more idiotic than a double bass concerto? The problem with a double bass concerto, of course, is that the only way it's going to be satisfying is if the double bass plays in a register which the cello could do so much better. And yes, you may get a double bass player who's playing in the high register of the instrument is so thrilling that you don't notice it's not a cello. But why not use a cello? A contrabassoon, a piccolo, anything that has these terrible, terrible limitations is always going to be unsatisfying when placed in an ensemble consisting of instruments that can do all the things it can do, only more and better. And so percussion concertos, for that reason, have never, ever thrilled me, much as I adore percussion, because I think percussion is genuinely musical. I think it has something really serious to contribute. As I said, percussion ensembles, I think, are fantastic. There are wonderful combinations of percussion and solo instruments and melody instruments. One ensemble that I really think needs to be exploited, or should be, is a string quartet with percussion. That, to me, seems like it would be just the most fabulous thing, because string quartets themselves can start to sound a little monochrome after half an hour, and percussion as a coloristic device, or as an occasional solo, or as something totally contrasted in its strengths and weaknesses from the main body of the ensemble, that's all fabulous. So there's plenty of things that percussion players can and should do without having to be concerto soloists amidst a fabulous, usually enormous, symphony orchestra full of terrific instruments that immediately sound more appealing as soon as they start playing. Am I right? Am I wrong? It's just my opinion. I know, but I wanted to share that with you because I wanted you to think about this, about the idea of what the natural musical ability of instruments is and what happens when you start combining them. Ultimately, it seems to me it's the composer's job to really think about that issue, and I think most composers couldn't care less because they just like the challenge. It's a challenge of writing for some really strange instrument. Look at Aho. He's writing concertos for everything, for tuba and things, and one of his symphonies is a percussion symphony, and I saw it. I saw it in Lahti, Finland, where they performed it. And I thought it was enormously disappointing as a work because it had no musical substance. It really didn't. There's just a limit to how much you can do in a symphonic medium, particularly, with a limited bunch of percussion instruments. And he had a whole percussion ensemble that he wrote for. It wasn't just one person. But that's the way it goes. And I hope that this gives you a little bit to think about when you're listening to a piece of music and you're listening to the way composers write for instruments and combine instruments with other instruments and instruments with voices and instruments and percussion. These are all, I think, fascinating issues. And they have led to me concluding, alas, that the percussion concerto is a curiosity. What will change my mind, of course, is when I hear one that completely blows me away in terms of its musical substance and the amazing naturalness and idiomatic quality of the writing for the instruments and the interactions between them. But until that happens, I'm sticking to my guns and saying percussion concertos are impossible. So keep on listening, folks, and make up your own mind. See what you think. Take care. Thank you for joining me.